Okay. You might hear some Uyghurs, if you were ever talking to a Uyghur, they might say that they have a very long history of Uyghur people in the Tarim Basin. The reality is a little bit more complicated than that, because you had a lot of different people living in the Tarim Basin. Uyghurs are a construct of the 20th century. They're a construct of socialist nationalities policy. But if you look through the history of the peoples who lived there, you have, some of the earliest people, it's kind of fascinating, and you could spend a lot of time actually reading about them. There are well-preserved remains of Caucasian peoples who lived in the Taklamakan desert 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago. Today, we don't really know the identities of these peoples. But they've left very well-preserved mummies that are very fascinating to look at. But if you look at the actual DNA record of these mummies, they share about 1% of DNA in common with contemporary Uyghurs. So there were peoples who lived here 6,000 years ago, but they're not related in any meaningful way to contemporary Uyghurs living in the region. We have the Tokharians, who spoke an Indo-European dialect. The Tokharians, they were another Caucasian race living in the Tarim Basin about 4,000 years ago. And they were driven away by the Huns, or in Chinese they're referred to as the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu defeated the Tokharians and then moved them out west and into Bactria, where they joined the Bactrian kingdom. And then about in the 7th century, you had the Turks in the Tarim Basin, but these aren't the same as contemporary Turks. These are historical Turks. These are, they spoke a language related to contemporary Turkish, but they practiced a chauvinistic religion that's not related to Islam. They're just a very different people. But with each of these different peoples, you get a little bit more DNA mixed in with the DNA of contemporary Uyghurs. The Uyghur kingdom was a Buddhist state centered in what is today eastern Xinjiang. The Uyghur kingdom, in the Uyghur kingdom, people, Uyghurs claim this as their historical progeny, but the reality is the name is the only connection between the two. There is, the Uyghur name is just chosen for contemporary Uyghurs based on this kingdom, but they actually had very little in common with contemporary Uyghurs culturally. And then with the Mongols ran out a lot of other groups and dominated the region for a while. So at any rate, all of these people, they contribute to contemporary Uyghur identity, but these are not all Uyghurs. So anyone who said that Uyghurs have 6,000 years of history in the Tarim Basin would be, they'd be oversimplifying their history. Xinjiang was the meeting place of a lot of religious traditions along the Silk Road. The earliest religious traditions, since we know very little about them, we will call them shamanistic religions. And then Zoroastrianism, you saw the flow of Zoroastrianism from Persia into the Tarim Basin, Manichaeism, Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity. And so, prior to the advent of Islam, evidence suggests that these religious traditions, they tended to have a fairly peaceful coexistence within Xinjiang. There are representations of Manichaean, Buddhist, and Nestorian Christian religious leaders talking together. There are historical records of the exchange of ideas. But ultimately, Buddhism was the most prevalent religion in the Tarim Basin for much of its history, up until about the 10th to 15th centuries. Historically, there's a reason why these people of the Alta Shahar, they did not identify with each other because it was very difficult for them to actually organize in a meaningful way to confront peoples who were located at higher altitudes than they were. So this is a very low ground, they're very vulnerable, whereas people coming from almost any direction would be coming from higher ground and have an advantage over the local peoples. So peoples of the Tarim Basin, they historically faced problems from Xiongnu, from Tibet. There were periods where the Dalai Lama was very warlike, and Tibetans overran the entirety of the Tarim Basin. The Zungars, the Mongolians, and coming from the north, from this high ground, and also from the Central States. There's historic interactions between the Central States and the Tarim Basin. Okay, we talked about that. The first interaction of Xinjiang, the first interaction between the Tarim Basin and the Muslim world was in 751, the Battle of Talas. The Battle of Talas, Arab troops were allied with Tibetans, and they attacked the far western Tarim Basin. Ultimately, that attack was repelled by from representatives by the Tang Empire, who was ruling the Central States at that time. The Islamization was a very slow process. It took about 5 centuries. The first successful movement of Islam into the Tarim Basin was with the conquest of the Khanates from Central Asia into the southwest Tarim Basin. So when the Khanates defeated much of the western Tarim Basin, then you had a situation where in the west you had the Muslims, and then in the east, in the eastern part of the region, you had a Buddhist kingdom. Okay. I'm just going to briefly talk about what it meant to be converted, though. So you had people who they believed strongly in their Buddhist faith, but then they were conquered by Muslim invaders. And basically, once the king was conquered, once the king was put into submission, then he would be forced to convert. And then when the king acknowledged his conversion to Islam, then all of his subjects would, by extension, also convert into Islam. So it takes a long time, even after people are supposedly Muslims, it takes a long time for people to actually internalize and to understand what it means to be Muslim, or to believe in the Islamic texts. In Xinjiang, because of this difficulty, the most common form of Islam was Sufism. And this allowed for the incorporation of mystic beliefs into the practice of Islam. Syncretism is when it's like the mixture or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. So people had existing Buddhist ideas, they had existing shamanistic ideas, they had existing Manichaean ideas, and then all of these would be incorporated into their practice of Islam. And that's ultimately how Xinjiang, or how the Tarim Basin was able to become an Islamic area, predominantly Islamic area. Okay, so like I said, there's a lot of buildup for just suspicions. Throughout the Taklamakan Desert, throughout the Tarim Basin, there are these mazars, where a mazar is an Islamic shrine or mausoleum, often erected in the memory of a saint or holy person. So these mazars, they have different flags, different things that are tied to living things, like trees. As you'll see in that book, it's often the name of the book that I passed around is The Living Shrines of China, I believe. Those are living shrines. You have the flags and things like that tied to a tree. You don't really see this elsewhere in the Muslim world. It's mostly in the shrine, in the mazars of Xinjiang. I'm going to just speak briefly on Tibetan prayer flags, but I am not an expert on that subject. But Tibetan prayer flags, they originate from a pre-Islamic, pre-Buddhist tradition, a shamanistic, the Bon tradition. You don't really see prayer flags used elsewhere in the Buddhist world. So you see this uniquely in Xinjiang. You see the unique use of these kinds of flags tied to living things. And then in Tibet, you see the prayer flags. If you look outside, you can see those flags tied to the trees outside. And this leads me to question, and this might be something to look into in future study, but do they come from the same pre-Buddhist tradition? It's possible that there's a common shamanistic practice that would be in common between the Tarim Basin and Tibet. If you look at the map, the two places are so closely geographically located that it's not an unreasonable thought. Another thought is that Tibetan culture might have had significant sway in the Tarim Basin. There were times that Tibetans conquered the region, and there was a lot of exchange of ideas along the Silk Road. So it's very possible that this might have been something that was shared later on. But regardless, we have this real similarity between the prayer flags of Tibet and then these Uyghur mazars. These are just some pictures of the Imam Asim Mazar in Hotan, these are my own pictures. I didn't want to steal other people's pictures, so I just put a few pictures of this one place. But as you can see, totally dead desert in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, that's the conclusion of my presentation. Like I said, a lot of build-up, and then just questions at the end. I'm not really sure, but it'd be worth looking into. I thank you for this opportunity, and thank you.